You know, there's a specific kind of madness that only existed in the mid-1980s. It was a time when safety was a suggestion, excess was a virtue, and the rulebook was basically just a list of things engineers hadn't figured out how to cheat yet. But even in that era of absolute insanity, there was one car that stood out. Not because it was the fastest, though it was blindingly quick, not because it won the most races, spoiler alert, it didn't, but because it represented the most audacious, technically clever, and frankly unhinged engineering gamble in the history of motorsport. I'm talking about the MG Metro 6R4. And here's the thing. Everyone thinks they know why Group B got banned. They think it was just the danger. But if you look closer at the 6R4, you start to realize that maybe, just maybe, the problem wasn't just speed. The problem was that cars like this were becoming too smart for the sport to handle. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about forgotten legends of the automotive world. If you're someone who loves deep dives into the engineering and the stories behind the cars that should have been world beaters, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Look, to understand why this car is so special, you have to understand the world it was born into. Imagine the automotive landscape of 1984. It was beige. If you lived in Britain, you probably drove something terrible. The roads were full of cars that rusted if you looked at them wrong, and engines that struggled to start on a cold Tuesday. And sitting right at the bottom of the food chain was the Austin Metro. It was a shopping trolley. It was the car your grandma bought because it was easy to park at the bingo hall. It had an A-series engine that could trace its roots back to before most of its drivers were born, pushing out maybe 40 or 50 horsepower if you were going downhill with a tailwind. It was practical, it was sensible, it was boring. Now contrast that with what was happening in the forests of Finland and the mountains of Portugal. Group B rallying was exploding. This was the era of the Audi Quattro, the Peugeot 205 T16, the Lancia Delta S4. These weren't cars, they were spaceships made of Kevlar and magnesium. Audi had changed the game with four-wheel drive, proving that grip mattered more than anything. Peugeot had countered by moving the engine to the middle, proving that balance was king. Lancia was experimenting with supercharging and turbocharging at the same time because, apparently, complex plumbing was their love language. It was an arms race, a literal war of technology where budget caps didn't exist and physics was just an obstacle to be bullied into submission. And into this arena of gladiators and monsters walks British Leyland. Now you might be thinking, British Leyland? The company that went on strike every time the tea ran out? Yes, that British Leyland, the corporate equivalent of a disastrous family reunion. They looked at Group B, the most competitive, expensive, and dangerous motorsport on the planet, and said, "We want some of that." It sounds ridiculous. It sounds like a joke. But here's what most people don't realize. They were deadly serious. And because they knew they couldn't build a competitive rally car on their own, they did something brilliant. They picked up the phone and called Williams. Yes, that Williams. Frank Williams. Patrick Head, the team that was busy conquering Formula One. Imagine the meeting. You have these F1 engineers, guys obsessed with aerodynamics and ground effects, being handed the keys to a humble Metro and told, "Turn this into a Quattro killer." It's like asking NASA to turn a toaster into a lunar lander. The brief was almost impossible. They needed four-wheel drive, they needed massive power, they needed it to be compact, and they needed it yesterday. Most engineering teams would have just bolted a turbo onto the existing engine, thrown some wide arches on it, and called it a day. But Williams didn't do good enough. They looked at the rulebook, looked at the Metro, and basically threw the entire car in the bin. See, the brilliance of the 6R4 wasn't what they added, it was what they rejected. At the time, the turbo religion was absolute. Everyone believed that to win in Group B, you needed forced induction. You needed a turbo the size of a dinner plate, forcing air into the engine to make big horsepower. Audi did it, Peugeot did it, Ford was trying to do it with the RS200. But Patrick Head and the team at Williams looked at the data and saw a flaw, a massive, glaring flaw that everyone else was ignoring. turbo lag. In the mid-80s, turbo technology was primitive. You'd put your foot down, count to 3, write a letter to your mother, and then the power would arrive. It was like an on-off switch. Nothing, 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 and then suddenly you're doing 100 miles an hour sideways toward a tree. On a racetrack, you can manage that, but on a rally stage, on gravel, ice, and mud, where you are constantly feathering the throttle to balance the car, lag is a killer. It breaks traction when you don't want it to and denies you power when you need it most. So Williams made a choice that shocked everyone. They said no to turbos. This is where it gets really interesting. They decided to go naturally aspirated, but to be competitive without a turbo, they needed a big engine, a really big engine. And the Metro is, well, it's tiny. You can barely fit a suitcase in the back, let alone a race engine. So they had to get creative. They needed a 3-liter V6, but British Leyland didn't make a V6. They had the venerable Rover V8, a legendary engine, but it was too big, too heavy, and had too many cylinders for the class they wanted to enter. So what did they do? They literally cut the V8 down. They lopped off 2 cylinders, redesigned the heads to have 4 valves per cylinder, and created the V6 V4 engine.
Let me put this into perspective for you. This wasn't just modifying an engine. This was surgery. They created a 3-liter dual overhead cam 24-valve V6 that could rev to 9,000 RPM. Think about that number, 9,000 RPM, in a rally car in 1985. It sounded like a chainsaw fighting a hurricane. It produced 410 horsepower instantly. No lag, no waiting. You touched the pedal and the earth rotated beneath you. It was a masterpiece of mechanical grip and response. But where do you put a massive V6 in a car the size of a shoe? You can't put it in the front, the handling would be terrible. You can't put it in the back like a Porsche 911 because the pendulum effect would kill the driver on the first corner. So they put it in the only place left, inside. They mounted the engine backwards, right in the middle of the car, essentially where the back seats used to be. The driver and co-driver were basically sitting in the engine bay, separated from 410 horsepower of screaming metal by a thin piece of firewall and some hope. The result was a car that looked like a Metro, but shared absolutely nothing with it. I mean, look at the bodywork. It looks like it's wearing another car as a suit. Those massive box arches, they weren't for style. They were there to cover the enormous track width needed for stability. The wings, the scoops, every single weird angle on that car was there to feed air to the engine or keep the car pressed into the mud. It was ugly, let's be honest. It was spectacularly ugly, but it was a functional ugly. It was the kind of ugly that said, I don't care what I look like, I'm here to rip your face off. And the craziest part? It worked. On paper, it was perfect. While the Audi drivers were waiting for their turbos to spool up out of a hairpin, the Metro was already gone. While the Lancia drivers were battling supercharger belts and turbo heat, the Metro was just screaming its way to the red line with linear, predictable power. It was a scalpel in a world of sledgehammers. It was British engineering flipping the bird to the rest of the world. But as we all know, being clever doesn't always winning, and the tragedy of the 6R4 is that just as they figured out how to make it work, the world decided it didn't want it anymore.
So picture this. It's early 1985. The car's built. It looks like a bulldog that's been taking steroids. It sounds like the apocalypse, and Tony Pond, British rallying legend and all-round brave soul, is testing it. And immediately the numbers are terrifying. He's lapping test tracks faster than the Quattros. He's faster than the Peugeots. The theoretical performance of this naturally aspirated monster is off the charts. The instant throttle response is doing exactly what Williams said it would do. It's digging the car out of corners while the turbo cars are still taking a deep breath. For a brief, shining moment, it looked like British Leyland, of all companies, had actually cracked the code. They had built the ultimate weapon. But then, as always seems to happen in these stories, reality decided to intervene. And reality hit them with the one thing they hadn't fully accounted for: physics.
See, when you put a 410 horsepower engine inside the cabin of a compact car, you don't just get speed, you get heat, a lot of heat. The 6R4 wasn't just a rally car, it was essentially a mobile sauna designed to roast its occupants alive. The V6 was sitting inches behind the driver's head, there was no airflow in there. During testing, the temperatures inside the cockpit were reaching levels that were bordering on medically dangerous. Drivers were coming back to the service park looking like they'd just run a marathon in a volcano. They tried everything to fix it, roof vents, extra ducting, heat shields, special suits, but nothing really worked. You just had to accept that driving a 6R4 meant sweating out half your body weight every stage. It was a physical endurance test as much as a driving one. Then there was the transmission. Remember, this was a bespoke system. Williams had designed a brilliant four-wheel drive system with 3 differentials, including a fancy Ferguson viscous coupling in the center. It was space-age stuff. But the brutality of rallying is different from the precision of Formula One. The gearboxes started eating themselves. The torque of that V6 was just shattering the internals. They'd last about 1 stage before turning into a box of expensive neutral. And that viscous coupling, it had a nasty habit of overheating on long stages. Imagine that for a second. You're flat out through a Welsh forest doing 120 miles an hour on gravel, trusting the four-wheel drive to pull you through the corner. Suddenly, the center diff cooks itself and the front drive is gone, instantly. No warning light, no buzzer. You are suddenly piloting a mid-engined, short-wheelbase, rear-wheel drive rocket ship with 400 horsepower. That's not driving, that's managing a catastrophe.
Despite the heat and the mechanical fragility, the potential was undeniable. The car made its debut at the RAC Rally in November 1985, and guess what? It was magnificent. Tony Pond drove the wheels off the thing. In a field dominated by cars that had years of development behind them, the brand new, unproven Metro finished third. Third! It was beaten only by the factory Lancia Delta S4s, cars that were effectively limitless budget machines. It was a David versus Goliath moment. The British press went wild. The fans went wild. It seemed like the gamble had paid off. The 6R4 was competitive straight out of the box. The 1986 season was supposed to be the year the Metro took over the world. But if you know anything about rally history, you know that 1986 wasn't the year of triumph. It was the year of tragedy. The atmosphere in Group B had changed. It wasn't just about the engineering anymore. It was about the madness. The cars had become too fast for the stages. We're talking about machines that could accelerate on gravel faster than a Formula One car could on tarmac. And the crowds were out of control. You have to see the footage to believe it. People standing in the middle of the road, parting like the Red Sea milliseconds before a car arrived doing 100 miles per hour. They wanted to touch the cars. They wanted to feel the danger. It was a recipe for disaster, and disaster didn't wait long. It happened in Portugal, the 3rd round of the 1986 championship. The 6R4s were there, looking to build on their success, but on the very first stage, Joaquim Santos, driving a Ford RS200, another British Group B challenger, crested a rise to find the road completely blocked by spectators. He swerved to avoid them, lost control, and went into the crowd. 3 people died, dozens were injured. It was carnage. The top drivers, including the Metro team, withdrew from the rally in protest. They said it was impossible to drive safely. They said the sport had lost its mind.
That should have been the wake-up call. But the circus moved on. The FIA dithered. The racing continued. And then came Corsica, May 1986. Henri Toivonen, the young superstar of Lancia, was leading the rally. He was driving the Delta S4, a car so fast he claimed it was frightening to drive. On a twisty mountain road with no spectators around, his car left the road and plunged down a ravine. The fuel tanks exploded on impact. There was nothing anyone could do. Toivonen and his co-driver, Sergio Cresto, were gone. That was it. The line had been crossed. The FIA met within hours and announced the inevitable.
Group B was banned. At the end of the 1986 season, the monsters would be outlawed. Group A, slower, heavier, production-based cars, would take over. Now stop and think about what that meant for the MG Metro 6R4. Lancia and Peugeot had at least won championships. Audi had changed the world with the Quattro. They had their glory. But the 6R4? It was barely a year old. It was still in its teething phase. All that money, all that effort, all that genius engineering from Williams, it was suddenly worthless. The 6R4 became a warrior without a war. It was like training for the Olympics your entire life, showing up in peak physical condition and being told the games were canceled forever. Overnight, the 200 cars required for homologation became white elephants. Austin Rover had built them to race, not to sit in showrooms. They had spent millions developing a car for a formula that no longer existed. It was a financial disaster. They had to get rid of them. And this is where the story takes a turn from tragic to bizarre. What do you do with 200 banned rally cars? You can't race them. You can't really drive them on the street. I mean, have you seen the visibility? It's terrible. But they had to sell them.
So they put them on sale. The Clubman version, a slightly detuned model making about 250 horsepower, was offered to the public. The price? £40,000 initially. Nobody bought them. They dropped it to £16,000, still struggling. Eventually, they were practically giving them away just to clear the stock. Imagine that today. You could walk into a dealership and buy a mid-engined V6 Group B rally car for the price of a Ford Escort. It was madness. But the people who did buy them, they discovered something special. They discovered that while the 6R4 failed as a WRC contender, it was arguably the greatest club racer ever built. Because it was naturally aspirated, it was easier to drive than the turbo monsters. It was reliable once you weren't pushing it to WRC limits. It dominated rallycross for a decade. It became a legend on the national circuits. It found a second life, not as a world champion, but as a cult hero. The ban, which killed its professional career, actually saved the car for the enthusiasts. It meant that these cars weren't destroyed in crashes or crushed by the factory. They were sold to privateers who cherished them. But the engine had a destiny even stranger than the car itself. You see, a good engine never dies. It just finds a new home. And the V6 4V was a very, very good engine. When Group B died, Tom Walkinshaw Racing, TWR, looked at that compact, lightweight, high-revving V6 and thought, I can use that, but not for a rally car, for something much faster. Tom Walkinshaw Racing took the design of that orphaned V6, the one built for a rally car that was now illegal, and they looked at it with fresh eyes. They bored it out to 3.5 liters. They added 2 massive turbos. And then, in one of the most controversial moves in automotive history, they dropped it into the back of the Jaguar XJ220. Yes, that's right, the Jaguar XJ220, the poster child of 90s supercars, the vehicle that held the record for the fastest production car in the world at 217 miles per hour, was powered by an engine designed for an Austin Metro. Think about the absurdity of that for a second. Buyers who had put down deposits for the XJ220 were promised a V12. They were promised an aristocrat's engine. Instead, they got a scrappy, rough-and-ready V6 that started life trying to beat Peugeots in a forest. People were furious at the time. They sued Jaguar. They demanded their money back. But looking back now, it's poetic. It proves just how over-engineered that original Williams design really was. That block, that architecture, was robust enough to power the fastest car on Earth. The 6R4 didn't just die, it donated its heart to a king.
But let's bring it back to the Metro itself. What is the real legacy of the 6R4? It's easy to look at the stats. 0 world championships, a handful of podiums, a short career, and call it a failure. But that misses the point entirely. The 6R4 wasn't about winning, it was about the attempt.
It was about a company that everyone had written off, a company that was the punchline of every joke, standing up and saying, "No, we can do this." It was the automotive equivalent of a punk rock band crashing a classical orchestra recital. It was loud, it was rude, and it didn't care if you liked it. Today, the market finally understands this. If you want to buy a genuine MG Metro 6R4 now, you are not paying £16,000. You're looking at six figures. Easy. The Clubman cars are collector's items. The genuine works cars are practically priceless. They have become rolling pieces of history preserved in amber. Driving one today is an assault on the senses. There's no power steering, there's no ABS, there's no traction control. It's just you, a steering wheel that fights you every inch of the way, and that deafening, glorious howl of the V6 right behind your ear. It's a reminder of a time when driving was a physical fight, when you had to wrestle the machine into submission. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Group B hadn't been banned, if the madness had continued for another 2 or 3 years. Would the 6R4 have evolved into a champion? Honestly, probably not. The competition was moving too fast. Lancia was already testing carbon fiber chassis tech. Audi was working on mid-engined prototypes. The Metro, with its aerodynamic profile of a brick and its heat soak issues, would have struggled to keep up, but it would have been spectacular to watch them try. We were robbed of seeing the 6R4 reach its full maturity. We never got to see the Evo 2 version that surely would have fixed the cooling. We never got to see it with a proper sequential gearbox. It remains a what-if story, a fragment of potential that was never fully realized. And maybe that's why we love it so much. Champions are boring. Dominance is boring. We respect the Audi Quattro, but we love the 6R4. We love it because it's flawed. We love it because it's an underdog. We love it because it's a Metro that took steroids and tried to fight God. It represents a specific moment in British engineering where ambition completely outstripped reality. It was too clever for its own good, too fast for the regulations, and too wild for a world that was rapidly becoming obsessed with safety and risk assessment.
The 6R4 wasn't banned because it was the most dangerous car. It was banned because it was part of a movement that had lost touch with reality. It was a casualty of war. But what a casualty! It proved that you didn't need a massive budget or a German factory to build something incredible. You just needed some aluminum, some fiberglass, and a shed full of engineers who refused to be told that's impossible. So the next time you see an old, rusting Austin Metro in a scrapyard or parked on a driveway, don't just walk past it. Stop and take a look. Remember that for one brief shining moment in the 1980s, that humble little shape was transformed into a monster. Remember that it shared DNA with the fastest car in the world. And remember that sometimes the cars that don't win are the ones that matter the most. The MG Metro 6R4 was a failure by the record books, but it was a triumph of the spirit. And in the end, isn't that what we're all looking for? Not just the victory, but the story? That's the story of the 6R4, the car that was too wild for rally and just wild enough to live forever in our hearts. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the madness of Group B, you might want to check out my other video on why the Lancia Delta S4 was actually powered by black magic and terrifying engineering. I'll link that right here on the screen. Thanks so much for watching Legacy Motoring. Drive safe, stay curious, and I'll catch you in the next one.